This is Away Series 2, a podcast for anyone interested in a fresh approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 9. I've been putting this off because this chapter, we agnostics. While the aim of the chapter is to help those who are struggling with the idea of turning their will and their lives over to a supernatural higher power, most of the chapter they're not describing an agnostic, they're describing an atheist. An agnostic, in the context of theism, is a person who holds that the existence of God is unknown or unknowable. It means more or less the same outside that context, too, a person who holds neither of two opposing positions on a topic. For example, someone may be agnostic on the subject of legal abortion. I'm not, of course. I'm not at all agnostic on that subject. I'm quite vehemently pro-choice. In any case, I consider an agnostic with regard to God more of a skeptic. An atheist, however, denies the existence of God or any supreme beings. In fact, the word agnostic is derived from the Greek word, which means not known or incapable of knowing, and atheist is derived from the Greek word, which means godless. So this chapter is meant to provide guidance to those struggling with the concept of God. And if you're one of those people, there are parts of this chapter that will probably help. I'd argue that the language of the chapter makes even the helpful ideas a little hard to dig up. Regardless, let's dig in. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. To one who feels he is an atheist or an agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Okay. Firstly, we know, or I know for sure, that spirituality is not the only solution for my illness. For me, it's not even a part of it, at least not in the ways the writers meant. But, in fact, we discussed briefly in the previous episode the other part of this, that when we are caught in the vicious cycle of alcoholism, it's actually an incredibly difficult choice to leave the cycle. This is when quote-unquote normal drinkers don't get it. Like, how the hell could it be so hard to stop when you're about to lose everything? So let's reframe that last sentence so that it'll work for everybody, believer or not, sensitive or aggressive. To anyone caught in the web of alcohol addiction, it seems impossible that he or she will ever be free of it. To endure the familiar pain and suffering of alcoholism, or to live in the unfamiliar and sometimes terrifying present, are not, in fact, easy alternatives to face. I really do think it boils down to that, familiar versus unfamiliar. Most of us, in my experience, suffer with anxiety. For people with any emotional disorders, the unfamiliar can be terrifying. The writers often refer to fear as one of our primary problems. That was certainly true for me, only today we call it anxiety and we have a lot of treatments for it. Treatments that only work if you're not drunk all the time. Anyway, as someone who had lived in a near constant state of anxiety when I wasn't drunk, the prospect of living without alcohol was bleak. And even though my life was unbearable, the choice was still difficult to make. If you are a God person, and you do believe in the existence of an ultimate cause, he, she, they, it will be there with you as you take this leap. And if you do believe or want to believe, relax about naming it. Whatever it is, whomever it is, he, she, they, it is there with you when you're at your most uncomfortable. And for those of us who don't believe, but have a desire to better understand those who do, this is what they need, right? Who are you to say otherwise? If the only way someone is able to make the decision to abstain from alcohol is by believing that there is someone or something holding her hand as she heads into the unknown, so be it. At least in the rooms of AA. Outside the rooms, I make strong arguments for my doctrine. Inside the rooms, I only make very small ones. It isn't my job in AA to disabuse people of their theism any more than it's their job to disabuse or try to me of my atheism. In AA, it's our job to help newcomers to understand the basic principles of AA, which do not include religion. All right, moving on, bottom of the page and on to page 44. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. To be honest, and I say this a lot, shame is a great motivator. I'm not saying that wallowing around in self-pity or punishing yourself endlessly is a good thing. But whenever I want to do something quote-unquote bad these days, I recall the feelings of shame that inevitably come after the bad behavior. And these days, I just don't want to feel that way. It took a long time for me to understand shame as a motivator, but it's a primary driver for me now. I don't want to walk around feeling ashamed of myself for hurting myself or anyone else. I don't want to contribute to suffering, period. Doesn't mean I always succeed, right? And the thing I've said like 83 times already, most of us are not immoral people. We were sometimes badly behaved, and most of us have a good idea of what a contented life should look like. But the vision, the behavior was obliterated by booze. I believe that goodness lies within us all, except for those psychopaths we've discussed. Once the fog of alcoholism has lifted, I believe that finding your quote-unquote moral compass is not really that hard at all. And the steps can actually help you to do just that. In 4 and 5 and 8 and 9, you'll be examining from different angles ways in which other people behaved and ways in which you behaved. And from those angles will emerge a more complete picture of who you are, who you want to be, and who you don't want to be. As an aside, I was emailing the other day with a podcast listener, and she's really fucking smart. She's a newcomer, she's an atheist, and she's still dedicated to finding a way through the book and the steps, no matter what. Her questions are insightful and push me to think. She asked me, after having read an article somewhere online that said the steps were a tool to, quote unquote, deprogram the alcoholic mind, she asked, "From my limited experience, the steps will help me mend some fences, but how do they deprogram?" I actually spent a lot of time thinking about the question. I mean, I know that's what they do, but to properly articulate it, since I'm not a doctor or therapist, took me a while. I responded a few hours later with this. The steps are not as a whole about mending fences. I would argue that most people talk a good game in that regard, but don't actually do much to that end. The mending fences aspect, in my opinion, is almost a bonus. And in truth, it doesn't really happen until steps 8 and 9, formally. I view the steps as cognitive behavioral therapy in its simplest form, CBT, before it was a thing. So if we take that view, the CBT view, that is, how people feel is not determined by an event itself, but by how they perceive the event. You'll actually hear people in AA parrot this in another way, saying we have a disease of perception. If we plug those fundamentals into the step model, we have a working system for change. The fundamentals of CBT are based on 3 levels of cognition: core beliefs, dysfunctional assumptions, and automatic negative thoughts. Core beliefs are usually created in childhood and reinforced throughout childhood, not always. And some core beliefs are great and helpful, and some are really negative. The negative manifest in many different ways. I've found with women, they tend to manifest in the self, like I'm useless. Dysfunctional assumptions are usually very rigid ways of thinking, and negative automatic thoughts are somewhat self-explanatory. They're thoughts that are activated involuntarily in certain situations. We might also call that in AA the built-in forgetter, or autopilot. CBT is used to change those thought patterns in the areas needed. The aim is to change thinking, and by default, the behavior. The hardest part sometimes is allowing ourselves to be much more flexible than we're used to being. And this is what we call in AA being willing. And in AA, we're supposed to be focusing really on one goal to start: our maladaptive cognitive and behavioral patterns around alcohol. The goal of most CBT is to deal with the present, the here and now. To that end, you have a goal, a small, achievable goal. In our case, that's usually the 1 day at a time model, with each day being a goal reached. I honestly don't know how I got onto that topic. Because what the steps are really meant to do: help you find the real you, the good and kind you, beneath all the bullshit. So with that in mind, my choices really are to be quote-unquote doomed to an alcoholic death, or to be willing to be really uncomfortable because everything's unfamiliar. Death or discomfort. That's a slightly easier choice. I can do discomfort. I've done it for decades. Quote, "Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth to affect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. Let's do a complete overhaul of this paragraph, starting with the first sentence. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from trying AA. Then it becomes about willingness, which relates to both the believer and the non-believer. At the start, all we need to commence is an open mind. And here's the hook. No matter what you believe, everyone on the planet needs to commence in order to effect. Does that make sense? Action. Nothing comes from nothing. So whatever change you want to make, you have to make the decision, then you have to set a goal, then you actually have to do things to reach the goal. We must become more flexible. We must be willing to change before we can change. So, do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? Yes, all of us can answer yes. That power can, of course, be Yahweh, Jesus, Lakshmi, Demeter, Earth Goddess, or it can be the group. Right now, all you have to do is be willing to admit that you can't do it alone. And that's step 2, right? Done and done. I'm willing to be a bit more flexible and ask for help. And in a roundabout way, the writers say as much. Quote, that was great news for us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has? So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. Just one of those quotes you can keep in your back pocket when someone tries to foist their religious beliefs on you or tries to put down your beliefs. Should we skip the very annoying sentence on page 48? No. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. I mean, I bristle when people proselytize anywhere, especially in AA. And then this makes me bristle, more than bristle. Let's read. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it's impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point? Everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence but no perfect visual proof. And does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an all-powerful, guiding creative intelligence, right there our perverse streak comes to the surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. Oh my God. So why do we readily accept the theory of electricity? Because it's not a fucking theory, and it's not impossible to explain. We assume it will work in our homes because the theory, when put to the test, became a fact. A knowable, visible fact. A fact that, let me add, by 1939 was at least 60 years old. The quote-unquote theory of electricity dates back more than 2,000 years, with the first battery that we know of now created by the Parthian Empire, which ruled Baghdad around 250 BCE. Thomas Edison, as you hopefully know, invented the electrical light bulb in 1879. But many more inventors before him had produced electricity with varying degrees of success. To call it a miracle is an insult to every one of the scientists who gave us the gift of electricity. I want to scream at people who make analogies like this. Just because you don't understand the science doesn't mean it's a miracle. Look, have faith. Believe in whatever you want, whatever you need. But belief in an omnipotent higher power is not the same as belief in electricity. Only one requires blind faith, faith without proof. Moving on. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation, we agnostics and atheists chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and end of all. Rather vain, wasn't it? I can't with this. Firstly, agnostics don't usually take such a strong view of any of it. Secondly, atheists deny the existence of a god or gods, but most do not see human intelligence as the be-all, end-all. Quite the opposite. Generally, atheist doctrine starts and ends with question everything. Under the umbrella of atheism are varying arguments and definitions from naturalists like David Papineau, humanists Paul Kurtz, atheist existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, to the new atheists like Sam Harris. Among them, there is no single doctrine, although there is plenty of overlap. I think that humanism and its aspirations, published in 2003 and signed by 22 Nobel laureates and dozens more people, kind of lays it out very clearly and has a lot of overlap with what most self-defined atheists believe. I'll summarize. Knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Humans are an integral part of nature, the result of unguided evolutionary change. Ethical values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. Life's fulfillment emerges from individual participation in the service of humane ideals. Humans are social by nature and find meaning in relationships. Working to benefit society maximizes individual happiness. Sounds familiar, right? Especially those last three ideas. Anyway, moving on. I also bristle at the interpretation of atheism by some of the least humble people ever, the writers of this book, as vain somehow. From my perspective, it's just not. Most of the people I know who consider themselves atheist, and I include myself here, think that the human species is but a millimeter on Earth's timeline, and that Earth itself is just a blip on something still larger. We think that present-day man is quite limited, but that just because he or she does not know something yet doesn't mean we never will. Just because we don't know it now doesn't mean it's unknowable. That actually strikes me as quite a bit humbler than the man who thinks he was made in the image of God. Page 50. Instead, we looked at the human defects of these people and sometimes used their shortcomings as a basis of wholesale condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. So maybe that's true. It was certainly true of me when I was 15. 15, but then I grew up. Everyone has prejudices, and anyone who wants to become a better citizen of the world needs to be open to the idea of change. Changing your mind because you've gotten more information is a strength, not a weakness. It speaks to intelligence. Page 54, and the last page we're looking at in this chapter. We found, too, that we had been worshipers. What a state of mental gooseflesh that used to bring on. Had we not variously worshipped people, sentiment, things, money, and ourselves? And then with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, or a flower? In one form or another, we had been living by faith and little else. Imagine life without faith. Were nothing left but pure reason, it wouldn't be life. I mean, I love my life. I'm really happy, and it's based on reason. There's this guy in my husband's home group who, whenever he speaks, I mean, it's painful. He clearly struggles with rage issues, and, you know, he's the kind of person who just, you can't even look him in the eye because everything about him is so contrived. Nothing he says feels genuine. He always says, literally every time he speaks, I looked at the sunset and I knew God had painted it for me. Humble, huh? Just saying that now makes me cringe. It's uncomfortable because nothing about him speaks to serenity or contentedness, but he wants people to think he's those things. He wants to create an image of himself as wise and spiritual, and he's neither. He's not even very smart. It would be laughable if it weren't also dangerous. He has newcomers who almost idolize him and do his bidding like a cult leader. I don't know why I brought him up. I think maybe the line about worshipfully beholding the sunset, or the notion that we worship other people. No, it was never worship for me. It was awe. To be in awe of something beautiful is not the same as to worship it. To be inspired by the accomplishments of another person, to strive to be better. And as for the rest of the so-called worship, the worship of the material, first I'd argue that's America, it's capitalism. You have a choice how much to embrace it. Often we try to compensate for our feelings of worthlessness with material things, jewelry, clothes, sneaker collecting, something I had never even heard of till I moved to Long Island. But that's not alcoholic, that's human. It's something every religion and every irreligion, even Buddhism, has tried to cope with. Okay, I'm done, I'm sorry. This chapter is just ridiculous. It's not worse than Two Wives, but look, if you want to get closer to God, whatever name he or she goes by for you, do it. And if he, she, it doesn't have a name yet, but you want one, go explore. Explore churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, whatever. Read the Pali Canon, read the Sruti, the Quran, the Kujiki, the writings of Elizabeth White, Dianetics, the Old and New Testaments. Do the work. The last thing I want for anyone is atheism by laziness. But that's personal. It isn't AA. Whatever or whoever your higher power is or becomes, leave it at the door when you come into a meeting. With that, we are done. I hope this helped. I hope it reminded you of the truth that there is not only one way, but there is always a way.